Hello and welcome to this episode of the Reset Podcast. I'm your host, Norman Yo, CEO of the Cultural Communications Agency, Beach Flash. As you know, each episode I bring a different business leader, entrepreneur, really amazing game changer who's doing some great work. And this episode is no different. I'm super psyched to have Donna Rubin, who's the founder of the Speaking While Female Speech Bank and the consultancy Speaking While Female. So guess what we're going to be talking about? Women and speaking. It's going to be a great conversation. Take a listen. Hey, Donna.
Hi, Laura. Thank you for having me.
Sure thing. As we're now in a whole new era,
We
first time
are.
ever in this podcast. Thank God. But the podcast doesn't change, and so the first question doesn't change. So, Donna, what was your first job?
My first job. Well, I think I have a two-part answer. My first job was as a kid. Growing up in Dallas, I was a babysitter. I used to babysit for my parents' friends. And the funny thing about that, as I look back, I must have been about 13, 14, 15 maybe. I don't remember any of the kids. I don't remember any of the food that I must have raided in the refrigerator. I don't remember the music. I don't remember the television. I remember the books. Every time I went to a different house, I would raid the bookshelves. I remember specific families and their bookshelves, and I remember going through their books and pulling them off the shelves and looking at them. And if I go back to Dallas, sometimes I run into those families and I'm like, oh, I remember your bookshelf. I was a nerd. And I'm still a nerd.
These things are not bad. Same here.
but,
Total
the other
nerd
job
here.
that I was going to tell you, the other job that I remember, I was in my college when I had a summer job at a newspaper. I didn't really know anything about how newspapers worked, but I had a job as a reporter at a newspaper in a suburb of Dallas. It was called the Garland Daily News. And the summer was about maybe 6 weeks, five or 6 weeks, I can't remember. And they rotated me from desk to desk to desk. So I had a week on the sports desk. I had a week on politics covering government, and I went to the city council meetings, a week on the police and fire. Oh, this is the Neanderthal age we're talking. So there was actually a woman's page. And I had
Lord.
on the woman's page. It was like social events. But here's the thing. When I worked at City Hall, they were about to do a bond election, raise money to put new curbs and gutters into a certain section of Garland, Texas. And I didn't know anything about curbs and gutters. I'd never thought about where they come from and the fact that someone has to pay for them. Culverts. I remember I learned what a culvert was. And I wrote about the municipal bond election, the different kinds of bonds and how much money they wanted to raise, et cetera, et cetera. I really got into it. And then I went back to college because it was September. And I think it was September. I don't know why it sticks in my head, September 13th, something like that. I called my mom and I said, did the Garland bond election pass? And she was like, what? And that, I remember the scales fell from my eyes. That was an epiphany for me. And I realized it was just some curbs and gutters in Garland, Texas. But if I could care that much about it, I got really into it, into learning about it, synthesizing the information, distilling the information, and presenting it. And that essentially is explanatory journalism, and it's service journalism. And I fell in love with it. And that's when I learned about it.
Wow, really cool. That's the thing that's, those are kind of the experiences whereby it's like, oh yeah, I can totally take that with me, because if I can, all those things I learned about that go way into what my career path will end up taking me. So that's a great story, because who knew?
When you ask people what was your first job, almost always, more often than not, there is a tie between what they did, that person remembers, and what they did as a young person, and what the person that they became.
Yeah, it's why I ask. It's fascinating to see where it goes.
Yeah.
So you go from caring deeply about the municipal election till now. What's that journey been like?
Well, I was a journalist for a long time. Out of college, I was a newspaper journalist and a magazine writer. And I went and lived in London for a while and wrote for magazines and traveled around Europe. That was a lot of fun. And when I came back to the States, I was a speechwriter. And because speech writing is very writerly, it's probably the most writerly of the communication arts, in public relations, I suppose. So for someone who really likes language and constructing an argument, it was a natural evolution. And it was when I was a speech writer, working as a speech writer, I worked for a bunch of corporate CEOs, nonprofits, foundation, and also I worked for Dan Rather for a while as
Oh,
a news
wow.
producer. Yeah, he had a show after a program that I worked on, and then I worked for Martha Stewart for about a year. And it was when I was working for Martha Stewart that I started going to some of these women's conferences and noticing all the men on the podium. Even at women's conferences, there was a predominance of men on the podium. And then I started, because I had a background in journalism, paying attention to the op-ed pages, so many men's points of view, male perspectives, and it expanded from there, everything to, literary criticisms, analysis, sports analysis. Everywhere that there were gatekeepers of our culture, there was a predominance of male voices, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. And by this time, of course, women in the developed world, in the United States and other countries, there were more women getting advanced degrees than men. Women had more knowledge than men, um, in terms of academic knowledge, expertise, ideas, creativity, intellectual firepower, but it was not making it into the forums where our ideas are expressed, where our values are hammered out, where our priorities are evaluated and determined. I remember there was a point at which there was debate about the World Economic Forum in Davos. It's every year at the end of January, and they were making a big do out of the fact that they had raised the number of women members participants, to I think it was 17%, because it had been like 12%. I thought there's something really wrong with this. I have to do something that helps these educated, talented, experienced, creative women put their ideas into the public realm so that women can help change the world. Because we have so many problems in the world, we need women's creativity and ideas in the mix. And it's only very recently that we have been paying attention, and that the tide has shifted. And the events of yesterday, we're recording this right after the inauguration, seeing Kamala Harris in that highest position
Mm-hmm.
highest government position that a woman has attained is really heartening, regardless of our political views. We need more women's voices, expertise, and authority in our culture.
We could talk for hours about yesterday's
I
events.
talk for hours about it.
But this is about you, so we won't. But yeah, I think it's so very important that we hear women's voices, especially now. And I think of the amazing contrast of Kamala Harris and Amanda Gordon. Because I think it shows two different sides of the same coin, where it's like, uh, Amanda Gordon happens because there's a Maya Angelou who speaks at the Clinton's inauguration even before she's born in the early 90s. But then that's something that people can look to and see and understand that there's
Yeah,
a voice that you
it's
need.
very inspiring. But what's
Uh,
interesting, Laura, as you said, especially now, and I agree, especially now, but as a thought exercise, it's interesting to wonder what the world would have been like had we been benefiting from women's voices all along. And the voice is just, it's not just the
that's an easy
voice.
one.
It's not just the sound that comes out of our mouths as a voice or a speech. A voice is kind of a metaphor for all of our agency, our ideas and thoughts and creativity. So it is interesting to wonder what kind of world we would all be living in had we been more open to women's voices all along, or even earlier.
Well, it's funny because if you look at how the pandemic was handled, for example, all the countries that had female leaders all did remarkably better than those who had strong men or jerks as their prime ministers or presidents or chancellors. And that gives us a little bit of a window into it, because the traits that oftentimes people think are sort of the fact, our attraction for women are actually the things that you actually need to be a great leader. The ability to multitask, the ability to have empathy, in a way that like sometimes folks are like, oh, if you're an empathetic leader, blah blah blah. No, you've got to be this strong dude, and you're like, well, actually, you were able to save hundreds of thousands of lives by being upfront, telling people this is the story, this is what we have to do, going with the science. So, we have some, relatively recent examples of just from a leadership perspective, what that looks like. And that's not to say it's perfect at all, but you definitely see that there is a marked difference in the ways, things were handled with regards to the pandemic, with female voices being the leading voices versus not.
Very interesting.
So, now that you've got this really cool company, what is it you all do?
Well, there are really two parts to what I do. One is I have a consultancy, and I call it Speaking While Female, and it is focused on women. And I lead workshops in a number of topics, all of them interrelated and all of them aimed at the same goal, which is getting women's voices in the public sphere, public realm. So I teach thought leadership, how to think of yourself and become a thought leader and put your expertise into the world, self-advocacy, storytelling, and also public speaking. I teach a foundational workshop in public speaking, training women to be stronger public speakers, and then something I call power talk, which is using more powerful language, just simply being more powerful when you open your mouth and express yourself. But they're a suite and they're additive, so you can take any one of them, but they all sort of work together. But I should note also that men are always welcome, and men benefit, and we benefit by having them there. But I'm oriented to women and focused on issues that women tend to have more than men in the workplace. So that's one piece of my my project. But the other piece, which is really more unusual, is that I got very curious about the history of women's speech. Actually, I got curious about not so much the past, but the present, why it is that when we talk about great speakers, it's almost always a man. Because I was so ensconced in the speechwriting world, I noticed all the umpteen million times that men were quoted, men like Churchill and MLK and JFK and RFK and a host of other men. And I started to wonder, where were all the quotes by women? And the follow-on from that is, where are all the speeches by women? And since I was a speechwriter, I went to my bookshelf and I pulled out a few volumes. I had a few collections, anthologies of women's speech, and I started looking through them, and I was aghast at what I found, which was, in some cases, no speeches by women, but in other cases, just a handful. And it was always the same handful. It was always the same women over and over and over. It was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, maybe Sojourner Truth, Helen Keller, Jane Addams, maybe Dolores Ibari. I mean, the creativity was non-existent when it came to finding compelling, interesting oratory by women. So I started buying more and more speech anthologies. I told you I was a nerd and very bookish. So I started buying all these speech anthologies. A lot of them I got on Amazon, inexpensively, but I ended up with 230 speech anthologies in the English language. That's just in the English language, not to mention all of them that have been published in German or French or other languages. But in any case, out of 230, I took them all, counted up the speeches by men, counted up the speeches by women, and stuck them all on an infographic, which you can find on the homepage of my website, speakingwhilefemale.co. And what it shows is, overwhelmingly, that we have portrayed the history of public speech as a male endeavor. And then the next question is, was it a male endeavor? So, of course, I had to take the next step, which was to create an online speech bank or archive of women's speech. So I started looking for women's speeches and throwing them onto the website. Literally, some days I would put 10, 20 speeches by women on there. Now I have something like 2,500 speeches.
Wow.
Some are contemporary. Some of them are from the modern period. But the majority of them were from the 19th century and earliest 20th century. And the fact is that women have been speaking. Women have been speaking on every issue under the sun. Women have been talking about, of course, housekeeping and family and marriage. They've been talking about values. They've been talking about police reform and prison reform and health and sanitation and, of course, suffrage and anti-suffrage. I mean, women have taken every possible position on every possible issue, right up through foreign policy and war and public affairs. But the gatekeepers of our culture, as I like to think of them, the gatekeepers haven't really been paying attention. So it's like that diagram that you find in Microsoft Office, where it's a circle that starts in one direction and then feeds on itself. It's a vicious circle in which men didn't pay attention to what women had to say. A woman would give a speech, maybe no man attended. Maybe they didn't write about it and make a transcript. It didn't appear in the local paper. It didn't get picked up in an anthology. I mean, women were speaking, women have been speaking, but the gatekeepers of our culture didn't pay attention, or they just didn't care what women had to say. And that is what I want to correct. I want to revise our history of oratory to include women, not just as a historical endeavor, but really because we need those role models. We need to be able to look back and see that women have played this role throughout history, and from them and be inspired by them. So that's my obsession.
It's so amazing. What has been some of the most surprising speeches that you found in developing the anthologies?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say. It depends on like what day or what hour of the day, because I'm constantly surprised. I add speeches all the time, almost every day. In fact, this morning I just added a speech given in 1902, I think, or 1909, by a Filipino woman who came to Boston and spoke to a Boston women's suffrage association, talking about, and at the time, the United States, America was at war with the Philippines. It was a Spanish possession, and we were at war with them. And she talks about the fact that they have different points of view politically, but as women, they shared many things in common. And that she talked about the powerful heritage of Filipino women and strong Filipino women. And it was really astonishing to me that she would make this voyage and have the courage to speak in front of this audience and talk about her heritage that she was so proud about. So I'm constantly adding speeches like that. You know, during the French Revolution, we always hear about the Robespierres and the Marats and the leaders of the French. There were women, a cadre of women who used their voices and spoke in public. That was the 1790s, 1780s, 1790s. There were women in France who spoke up during the Spanish Civil War. In this century, in the early part of this century, 1930s, there were a lot of women who used their voices and spoke up for both sides. So it's just a process of constant recovery and amazement to learn about the history of women's agency, using their voices and being agentive or having agency in history.
So cool. And helping women to find their voice in speaking. What are some like good tips that you had that you can sort of share with the audience?
Well, I think there's two parts to the work. One part is the mindset, and the other part is the skill set. And the skill set, there's tricks and tips that you can share about speaking and communicating your ideas. You can use more powerful language. You can speak to your audience. You can use evidence-based argument and establish your expertise with your experience and with facts and evidence. So that's all what I would fall under the category of the skill set. But the mindset is more fundamental. And the mindset, in some ways, is harder to address, and that is the mentality. How do we really accept within ourselves that we are qualified to put our expertise into the world, that we are experts, that we have knowledge, and that knowledge belongs in the world? And that's why Kamala Harris is so important. Again, no matter what your political beliefs, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, it's so important that we see her as a role model. You know, in my work with women, I can tell you that in general, not in every specific instance, but in the aggregate, if you ask a woman, what is your expertise? she will say, me? I'm not an expert. Or she'll say, somebody else knows more than me. Ask that person. Or I don't like to brag. I hear that all the time. I don't like
Oh, I
to,
hate that so much.
can I go last? When I go around the room and say, share your expertise, tell us what you are an expert in, can I go last? Women have so much discomfort speaking, and I'm very careful to emphasize it's not every woman. I'm talking about the aggregate, because there are always exceptions. There are a lot of men who don't like to speak or are not comfortable, and there are increasingly a lot of women who are comfortable, but in aggregate, more women have problems with this than men do. And that's what I want to tackle, is the mindset, helping you understand that the world needs your knowledge. The world needs your knowledge. You have this knowledge, you have this expertise, you have ideas, and that knowledge needs to be in the world to make the world a better place. And if you hold back, you are shortchanging not just yourself and your own career, but you're shortchanging your organization, the company or the organization that you work for, which needs that knowledge and agency. And you're also shortchanging the world that we live in.
Yeah, I find this often when I'm doing events, and when folks are like, how do you know to speak that way, Laura? And I'm like, because I have to. Like, this is the world we live in. If I want something done, I actually have to speak up. And I have something to say. We all have something to say. You wouldn't be in this room if you didn't deserve to be here. And so, yeah, I would agree. It's like there is this crisis of confidence that has happened to our gender that needs, recalibrating desperately.
Well,
Um,
I'd like to take the long view and hope that I'm contributing to this, but I don't expect this to go away. Frankly, I don't expect it to go away in my lifetime. I think I think we need to work on this over time and address it so that the next generation, the generation of that, after that, of young women grows up fully confident that they can put their knowledge into the world without hesitation. Just the fundamental assumption that their knowledge and ideas belong in the world, that would be major. That's what I'm working towards.
right there with you. I'm sure this has been not a bed of roses. Can you tell me about a time when you run into a challenge with this and how you sort of made it through?
Well, I didn't like to speak myself. I mean, there's a reason I became a speech writer. A speech writer is behind the scenes. And you could make the same argument about reportage, about journalism. I like to be on the sidelines, observing, distilling, synthesizing. And journalists, by my ethics, hold back from engagement because they want to be neutral or impartial or even give the impression of impartiality when they present the news. So I always saw myself as somebody in a more um, invisible role. But it's been through this work that I've been able to appreciate that I could step up and speak out. It has not been easy for me for me individually. I have not been comfortable as a public speaker, and the antidote for that is to do it more often. The more you
Hmm.
do it, the better you get. That's as simple as it is. But I'm still not terribly comfortable speaking in front of audiences, especially speaking in front of large audiences. I've just gotten more comfortable, and it's a lesson that you have to absorb at a really deep level. But if you make a mistake, if you open your mouth and the wrong words come out, if you hesitate, if you fumble, just go right on. First of all, most of the audience won't notice. Second, if they do notice, they'll forget a second later. It just doesn't matter. And our president now is a good example because Joe Biden fumbles all the time. His speech, he fumbled yesterday in his inauguration speech. He was trying to say, what was he trying to say? Rural and urban, which is an awkward formulation anyway. Many people would have trouble with that, but he stumbled over those words. He just keeps going. He knows it's not the
Hmm.
most important thing, and we accept that in him. We don't have to be perfect. We have to be human, and making that human connection is the most powerful thing, not the perfectionism that so often can drag us down or inhibit us.
But the thing, and I would agree with you because I similarly was not don't like public speaking, don't like crowds. Everyone assumes I'm a big extrovert because they see the stuff I do, and I'm like, no, I'm actually an introvert, and I don't, and I'm kind of shy and I have a stutter. And so as a result of that, I have to oftentimes like sort of trick my brain to kind of kick myself to go out and do public speaking. But I quickly learned that like, oh well, I just gotta go for do it. Just gotta do it. And sometimes when I talk really fast, it's because I'm trying to outrun my stutter,
Mm,
and I just was like, yep, I'm just gonna keep on going
mm,
because the stuff I have to say is important. And I
mm.
think it's also that's a key part of it. It's just like remembering that the stuff you have to say in the room that you're in is important. So just say it.
Right. And it's also helpful to really appreciate, to take on board and appreciate that the audience is to hear you. They want to hear you. And if you really take that on in a deeper level, it can give you the confidence you need to um, to expose yourself. Because public speaking and also really putting your ideas into the world, sharing your ideas, whether you're writing an op-ed or an article or a blog or even in some places in social media, putting your ideas into the world is a form of exposure. And to be comfortable with that exposure means really accepting that you're a human being like other human beings and that people want to hear what you have to say.
Absolutely. So, obviously working with women, especially during this crazy time of the pandemic, must be super crazy and stressful. What in the world are you doing for your self care?
I don't I don't know. I'm such a nerd that when I have free time, I do more research into women's speeches. I don't know if it's self care. It's a form of doing what I like. I'm a nerd. I said that. Years ago, I went on a tour of Kaika, which is the Rockefeller estate in Westchester. And I remember David Rockefeller had all the money in the world, could travel anywhere, could have all the lavish meals and hobbies that you could want. But the thing that he loved to do was sit in his basement and study beetles. He had a beetle collection. He had beetles from all over the world. He amassed quite an impressive collection of beetles. And if that's always stuck with me, human beings have a facility to get really interested, really, we say get in the weeds, to really nerd out. And I think that that's a form of self-care, is doing the thing that we love that brings us some comfort. And if, the word I use the word nerd, but I think it really relates to this idea of expertise. If you are an expert in something and you dig deeper into it and you're really into it and you learn about it, then you're amplifying your expertise and it's important to you. It's not that different from somebody who plays a video game and becomes an expert in all the angles and all all the tricks and all the ways to maneuver the material. I think it's a way of appreciating that everybody has to find their spot in the universe and explore it. And like anything, the deeper you go, the more rich and expansive it becomes. It's a paradox, but you go really, really narrow and really, really deep, and the world opens up in all kinds of really wonderful and astonishing ways.
Awesome. I think it's a great one. Thank you so much for sharing. So, do you have a give or an ask of the audience?
Well, I'm working on a Kickstarter campaign. It's not launched yet, but I'm working on it. And I'm going to raise the money to publish an anthology of women's speech. And I would ask the audience to go to my website, the Speech Bank, which is speakingwhilefemale.co, not .com, .co. Sign up for the newsletter, but there is no newsletter because I haven't had time to make one. And I don't know if I will. I suppose I will, but it hasn't really been a priority for me. But if you are in the mailing list, you will find out about my Kickstarter campaign. And then I'll have all kinds of really cool gift awards to give away. And the objective is to raise the money I need to publish the book. So that's my ask.
That's awesome. And a great one in that. We'll be sure to include that in the show notes so folks can follow along, sign up, hopefully be part of the Kickstarter and get you going. Fantastic. Yeah, Donna, you have just a wealth of delightful information, and it's just been so nice hearing. It's so nice to hear this because I think so many women just need to hear this over and over and over again that your voice matters, and there are and it's not you weren't just the first. There are plenty others. So come back in history, take a look. So
Thank
thank
you.
you
Thank
so
you.
much.
And thank you. I really think that you're offering a tremendous platform. I love your podcast. So keep up the good work.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. And that is our show.